What do you get when you put together years of research and development, patent attorneys, 3D printers, angry bass fishermen, deep sea divers, and hundreds or maybe thousands of pounds of catfish? I'll tell you. I'm Daniel Leake, founder of Catfish Sumo. First, here's a brief history of how rattles came to be used for catfishing. You see, our grandpas used to think that catfish were just bottom-feeding scum suckers rooting around in the mud for stinky stuff, and that's why they started adding peg floats to their rigs to hold their bait up off the bottom, making it easier for the catfish to find. And that made partial sense. But the number of bass and crappie anglers accidentally catching feisty catfish on artificial lures couldn't be denied. And catfish anglers started to realize how predatory catfish actually are. Because catfish use more than just their sense of smell to chase down live bait. That's probably not news to you. So one day somebody said, what if I take the hooks off my bass lure and use that for a line float? And it even has some little rattles inside that make a sound. And it didn't take long for the idea to catch on. And soon everyone and their brother started taking bass lure blanks, spray painting them, and then using them for catfish rigs. And then some companies started taking those bass lures, putting the word catfish on them, and pretending that they were meant for catfishing. But there's some major problems with using bass fishing lures for a catfish rig float. First, those bass lures are made to float on top of the water. They aren't made to handle the high pressure of deep water. So when that lure body is tied to lead and pulled to the bottom of a lake or a river, all those so-called catfish rattles leak. Next, those bass lure bodies are made to hold just a couple hooks, and that's all they really need to float, not chunks of bait. Try as they might, they simply don't have enough buoyancy for the bait that us catfish anglers use. The next problem is those bass lures are made to tie your line on the front and only face the pressure of a few pounds of fish. Because let's face it, even a state record bass isn't pulling as hard as a mid-sized catfish. So taking a bass lure, putting the word catfish on it, doesn't make it any stronger, and so they crack or pull apart, costing anglers fish. And that's sad. The last problem with these topwater bass lures posing as catfish rattles is there's never been a good way to attach them. You can loop your line through the metal guides and it creates pinch points that would weaken or break your line, or it creates torque that can crack it. Or if you tie to the front and to the back, you've added new failure points and risk pulling those connectors out of the thin plastic. So up until today, this is how Catfish Sumo has gone about trying to solve some of those issues. The first rattle we offered was our original rattling line floats, like these green crappie, goldfish, demon tiger, threadfin shad, crappie, sunfish, blue shiner. And we started by making the existing lure concept better with sturdier plastic, a better seal, more buoyancy, and tougher paint. Next, we built our heart pounder rattles, like these threadfin shad, the goldfish, and the green crappie. They're louder, they have lifelike paint, and a bigger float to float bigger baits, as well as our battle-proof connector that runs all the way through the entire lure body to prevent breaks and pullouts. And now we're introducing the Catfish Sumo Knotless Inline Rattling Line Float for catfish rigs. Here's 5 of the ways the knotless float outperforms the competition and why anglers are ditching their wannabe bass lures. It's the world's first truly inline catfish rattle. Line passes directly through the rattle without any knots or pinch points, so you won't risk losing that big fish. Next, the knotless float is louder with hyper-responsive sound. A lot of our development was designing shapes and rattles that made the most reverberation, even with really subtle movements underwater, so that it can attract fish in all sorts of water conditions. The knotless float uses our lifelike paint from our heart pounder rattles, and it's balanced in a way to always stay right side up, mimicking a realistic bait fish and triggering the predatory instincts of catfish, even when they aren't actively feeding. It's also floatier. Yes, that's a word. With the specially designed trapped air chamber and optimized rattles, you're able to float huge chunks of bait. And last but not least, one of the most challenging parts of this design is the pressure-tested strength. Knotless inline floats have a unique seam that won't take on water even at deep water pressure. That means that you can fish more places, find more fish, and stop wasting money on defective gear. To rig up your knotless inline rattling line floats, simply slip it on your leader ahead of your hook. When your rig hits the water, it'll slide into the optimal position for lifting your bait and attracting fish. Or if you're someone who has superstitions about how many inches away your rattle needs to be, simply use a bobber stopper. The knotless inline float takes all your needs into account, giving you a purpose-built rattling line float that checks all the boxes for serious catfishing. Get yours at catfishsumo.com.